Hello, everyone. I'm Libby Davies, and welcome, as always, to everyone tuning in tonight on Zoom and on Facebook. I'm very glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host, Robin Browne, for tonight's Off the Hill political panel. I live in the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples.
Hi, Libby, and welcome everyone. I'm coming to you tonight from Jamaica, which I'm visiting with my 92-year-old dad. So welcome.
Okay, hello to Robin's dad. Well, tonight we're joined by Avi Lewis for the first time. A very special welcome to you, Avi. Avi is a documentary filmmaker, journalist, educator, and co-founder of The Leap, a grassroots climate organization launched to upend our collective response to the crises of climate, inequality, and racism. And in 2021 federal election, Avi was the NDP candidate in West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country riding, and is currently an associate professor in geography at the University of British Columbia. We also welcome back Leah Gazan. Welcome, Leah. It's always great to have you on here. Leah is the Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre and the NDP critic for children, families, and social development, as well as the deputy critic for immigration, refugees, and citizenship. And last but not least, welcome back to Jim Stanford. Thanks for joining our panel, Jim. It's great to have you with us. Jim is an economist and the director of the Center for Future Work, a labor economics research institute with operations in Canada and Australia. He previously served as economist and director of policy with Unifor. So welcome, everyone. I do want to say that we got news earlier that Paul Taylor put his back out this afternoon. I feel really bad for you, Paul, and we really wish you a speedy recovery and hope that we'll see you next time. And Carl Nuremberg, Rabble's senior reporter, who's usually a regular on our political panel, will be back next time. So once again, thank you and welcome to all our panelists and welcome to all of you who are watching on Zoom. Please participate in the chat or ask questions to our panelists throughout the Q&A function. And we'll certainly do our best, as always, to address your questions. And for those of you watching on Facebook, welcome to you. So a week ago today, Krista Freeland donned a new pair of shoes and tabled the federal budget. Expectations were running high. In previous Off the Hill panels, we focused on answering critical questions related to the climate emergency, the rise of the alt-right, economic rights for workers, and truth and justice for Indigenous peoples, and of course, the war in Ukraine. And now we have the federal budget as a lens for these issues. So the big question for us today is, how did the budget stack up? I'm going to start with you today, Avi. And, you know, signs of concrete action to address the climate emergency were hoped for in this budget, but climate has seemed to take a back seat in government priorities, with fossil fuel companies using the war in Ukraine to urge expansion of operations. And in fact, the day before the budget, the government announced they were going to move forward with a $12 billion Bay du Nord offshore drilling project off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. So, Avi, what do you make of the government's contradictory stance, given their stated commitment to climate change?
Thank you, Libby. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm coming to you from Huilqui, otherwise known as Half Moon Bay, on Sechelt territory on the west coast. Look, what you're describing is part of a pattern. And I think it's worth zooming out as part of this conversation about the budget to look at the pattern. And when it comes to climate, I think the only way you can honestly put it is that the Trudeau Liberals have an abusive relationship with the truth. And this is a pattern going back many years. Let's just rewind a second to 2015 and the Paris Accords, and Trudeau just elected, Canada's back. And there was this sense that the Harper years were over and now we were going to have a climate serious government. And then for the next 4 years, he insisted that we could only have a climate deal in Canada if we had a new tar sands pipeline. So like, people aren't stupid. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, this is national gaslighting. There's no other way to say it. It's contortionist logic. And unfortunately, the corporate media were utterly complicit in those years. And so we wasted precious years of decade zero on the climate clock, arguing about whether or not we could have a new tar sands pipeline and still have a legit climate strategy. In 2019, that contortionist logic reached its peak when they declared a climate emergency one day and bought that pipeline the next. It's the same pattern of utterly contradictory messages. And our emissions keep going up and up and up. And then the 2021 election last year, on the basis of the analysis and carefully planted political narrative validated by a couple of partisan climate scientists, the Liberals won the narrative that they had the best climate plan of all the parties. They won the election, partly on the strength of winning that narrative, and they immediately launched their new gaslighting campaign, which we're in. Now the message box is we can increase fossil fuel production and export while we lower emissions from the fossil fuel sector. So as we lead up to the budget, just a couple of weeks ago at the end of March, the Liberals released their emissions reduction plan. I think it's important to just footnote quickly here that the Bill C-12, the Climate Accountability Act, which the NDP won important changes to in committee and in the negotiation round in the last minority parliament, that bill that law now requires the Liberals to submit a plan in advance of climate targets, and the NDP got a 2025 climate target, which means that in 2022 they have to release their plan. So that was the plan that we saw last month, and there were some very important parts of it, like they mapped out sector by sector how much we have to cut emissions to reach our insufficient but still, important goals. And in the emissions reduction plan, they show that there'll be a 56% increase in tar sands production this decade, while we cut emissions from the fossil fuel sector by 40%, in theory, in the same period. So when we come to the budget and they approve Bay du Nord, another multi-billion-dollar fossil fuel project, one day, and then they have a budget with a lot of hoopla about $9 billion worth of climate spending the next day, this is part of exactly the same pattern. And when you look at that new climate spending and the new climate measures in the budget, the lion's share is another handout to extend the life of the fossil fuel industry with carbon capture utilization, the most neglected letter in the acronym, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. This is a false solution. The entire environmental and climate community in Canada has denounced hundreds of academics, thousands of organizations. It is a bald extension of a new subsidy to the fossil fuel industry, which will extend its life, which will allow it to continue to increase emissions, all the while we're supposed to believe that they're going to come down. So these mixed messages have had, I think, a profound effect on our society, and the budget is a continuation of this. People are confused. They get these mixed messages, new fossil fuel projects, new pipelines, and all of these contradictory messages, and they think we're doing something, but so everything is okay, but it's not okay. They say it's not okay, but we're still doing the same things. In fact, we're doing more of them. So the public is confused, but these messages do have an audience. And that audience is the oil and gas industry. And the message to them from the Trudeau Liberals has always been and continues to be, don't worry about it. The status quo can continue. And that's a travesty. So now we're a super emitting pariah among rich countries. And the hard truth is that that won't change as these folks in this logic are in power.
Well, just a very quick follow-up, Avi. I think you've shown how one contradictory the government's narrative is, and how they're how they're targeting different audiences for different things, but also how complicated it is, and for the average person to wade through all of that, even just what you just said. And you're a guy who's right on the money, you're right up there monitoring this, and it says to me that we're in a time where it's more important than ever that accountability, whether it's through the NDP, the opposition, whether it's through NGOs, the activist community, is more important to ever. Otherwise, we never really know what the truth is. It's more important than ever to get that.
There is a truth, and Libby, it is intentionally confusing, but the real truths are actually pretty simple. And Jim has done incredible work, and Leah has done incredible work outlining that the fossil fuel sector, while it occupies this paramount place in the national narrative, is not a huge part of our economy. We can take care of those workers without taking care of those giant extractive corporations. The plans have been in place for years, and a just transition is perfectly within grasp, but we can't have a just transition unless there's actually a transition going on. And that means deep slashes to emissions, and that is just not going to happen as long as they prolong this industry.
Yeah. Over to you, Robin.
Yeah. You mentioned workers there, Avi, and so Paul Taylor, who was supposed to be with us, has opened a national discussion on new ways of thinking about work. So this is a question for all of you. We want to ask you about what was in the budget for workers, because this is something on the minds of many as a result of the pandemic, obviously, and of course, pre-pandemic with the growth of the gig economy. So how does the budget hold up there? Were there any substantive commitments for workers? And why don't we start with Jim?
Sure, Robin, thank you. I mean, the one thing that's good for workers is that this budget was not an austerity budget at all. It, in fact, increased spending with some incremental programs, incremental programs that obviously the NDP helped to negotiate under the terms of this new confidence and supply arrangement. Contrary to some of the claims from conservatives and bankers that we had to cut spending deeply in order to get the budget closer to balance. In fact, the government increased spending, including $5 billion for this dental care rollout. That will be important, and a number of other initiatives. Of course, there's still a lot more to do. We all would have liked to see more on the pharmacare side. That would have been very important for working people. And I'm sure that Jagmeet is negotiating as much as he can with the Liberals to try and concretize some of the commitments in that regard. The main thing from my perspective at kind of the macroeconomic level, the 1,000-foot macroeconomic level, was the general stance of this budget was not austerity. It was in fact heading a little bit in the other direction. And I think this fiscal stance is a positive one that will reinforce some of the progress that we've seen in labor markets and wages and so on as Canada continues to recover. All of us have questions about the Liberals, of course, and none of us would trust the Liberals as far as we could throw them. But this supply and confidence arrangement and the political pressure that we've been able to mobilize around it means this is, I think, a positive general budget, notwithstanding some of the problems in specific areas, such as climate change.
Thanks. Leah?
I would argue that in many ways this was an austerity budget. I think, we saw an increase of expenditures, which included $8 billion increase to the military. But there's other areas where this budget falls short. Certainly, it was not a budget compared to the last budget, which had over 100 billion in net new spending over 5 years. This budget has just 31 billion, in fact, in net new spending over the next 5 years. And despite the government's claim to be a feminist government, this budget certainly wasn't a feminist budget. And their own report actually revealed that on gender and diversity, it showed that 44% of the budget measures will benefit men and women equally, with 42% of that directly or indirectly benefiting men. So how does that impact work? I think a perfect example of this budget's neglect is the neglect of the caring economy. I mean, we just came through a pandemic. People putting their lives on the front lines and in industries like healthcare, long-term care. Where's the money in the budget for this? And personal support work that's mainly dominated by women. And, where do we see increases in the budget? I heard throughout the pandemic, shout outs to healthcare workers, calling healthcare workers heroes, but that certainly wasn't reflected in this budget. And I'll give you an example. I mean, Avi pointed to it. I think there's nothing easier to keep than a liberal broken promise. But Justin Trudeau promised 100.8 billion over 4 years to raise the wages of PSWs to at least 45 an hour and to train 50,000 more. But where is this commitment in the budget? Nowhere to be found. So, I think certainly the fact that we are still in the pandemic, certainly there was no reflection in the budget for workers is very evident. But, going back to what Paul has fought for very hard as something that we have in common, a guaranteed livable basic income. We know that we need to start redefining what work is, including unpaid care work, mostly performed by women, in the care economy, or people that can't work because of various reasons. We know that 70% of people with intellectual disabilities, adults, 70% live in poverty. People with complex mental health and trauma or invisible disabilities that may be able to work, 1, 2, 3 days a week, but might not be able to work 40 days a week. We need to start looking after people. And I thought I didn't really see in this budget a focus on people. I continue to see a focus on big business. A one-time tax certainly doesn't cut it. I was hoping to see a budget that was really focused on people, particularly talking about how we didn't want to go back to the normal. It appears that the Liberal government does want to go back to normal.
Where is the Canada Disability Benefit?
Yeah,
that was a bill that died on the order paper in the last Parliament.
Nowhere to be found. Nowhere in the budget.
I feel I'm in a tiny bit of a time warp here. I'm not gonna take over the hosting, but I feel like we got a possible episode of Counterspin here because I want to dig into this just a tiny bit, if Robin and Libby, if it's okay with you. Was this an austerity budget or was it not? Like I'm undecided, and I'm really interested to hear more from Jim. The framing of it, Chrystia Freeland framed it as an austerity budget. They got it out there. They emphasized that the debt to GDP ratio was going to go down over time. They emphasized that the tap, the faucet was slowly closing. Yes, there was new spending, right? And yes, in historic terms, there was new spending. But as Leah says, we're still in a pandemic. The spending is half what it was last year, and the need is only greater. So is there a difference, Jim, in your view, between the narrative of an austerity budget and the reality of where government spending is in historic terms, or what? Because I'm just not sure.
Well, Avi, thank you for asking me. Counterspin. We should redo Counterspin. I'm all for that. Let's get Counterspin rejuvenated on Rabble. I love it. There's all kinds of things that need to be done. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Now, the finance minister is always communicating to the Bay Street and to the markets and everything to try and indicate that she's being prudent. And the so-called guardrail that she has put on the budget is this debt to GDP ratio. Now, that is a pretty soft guardrail, and the finance community knows it. Okay, the financial markets are not convinced by her rhetoric that they're doing this, and most of them have been critical that she's still spending too much. And the debt to GDP ratio is falling, mostly because the economy is growing like gangbusters. And in both real terms, in terms of job creation, we had a very positive job number last week. And in terms of inflation, the reality is inflation has two sides to it, and it hurts workers if wages don't keep up, but it certainly generates big income. It generates big revenues for governments, and it reduces the real value of debt burdens. So these, in a way, are all things we've been fighting for since the 1990s, when the Bank of Canada went into a whole disinflation exercise, and we paid for it through a lost decade. So in macroeconomic terms, there is no way that you can describe this as austerity. It just is not credible. Now, does that mean that there are lots of other things that this government can and should be doing? 100%. And we've listed several of them: pharmacare, disability benefit, the climate investments, and so on. On the other hand, I think we do ourselves a disservice if we underestimate the amount of influence that we've had on this direction. The government spent big during the COVID recession, and they're still spending big. Not as big as they need to, but we shouldn't sell ourselves short, particularly in the context of this confidence and supply arrangement, where the NDP has, I think, done a tremendous service to Canadians to show that they can lever more commitment to important things and keep it headed that way. But it is not perfect, absolutely not. And we have to fight loudly and actively on the issues where it falls short, 100%.
Well, that we're going to go from the macro picture that you've just put forward, Jim, and I'm going to come back to you, Leah. But just before I do, I want to quickly go back to Robin and kind of get back to sort of the impact of the budget on different communities. And Robin, you just published a piece on Rabble this week, actually, on the impact of the budget on the Black community. So I think it would be great if you could just give us a few of your observations on what you felt about the budget as it impacted the Black community.
Yeah, no, thanks, Libby. Well, there were some things in there that we liked, that the community liked, that were good. For instance, there's $3.7 million for a Black-led engagement, design, and implementation of a mental health fund for Black federal public servants, right? And as you may know, in December 2020, a group of Black federal public servants brought a class action suit against the government, right? And they actually called for this, so they got that. Although they even said that this is a great start, but not enough, and it's going to take 4 years, and people are really struggling now with their mental health, right, because of the what they're enduring at work. Then there was the $50 million for the Supporting Black Canadians Communities Initiative to continue like empowering Black-led and Black-serving community organizations, which sounds good until you realize that it's just $25 million a year to support all Black organizations across the country, which seems kind of woefully inadequate. But one of the biggest omissions, though, was that there's no money to specifically collect data nationally on the disproportionate impact of COVID-19, of the pandemic on Black Canadians. And this is despite the mounting evidence of how Black Canadians were disproportionately, how they got sick or were killed by COVID because they worked in long-term care homes as personal support workers, or in Amazon warehouses, or driving Ubers, right? And how Black businesses, many of which were already struggling, failed during COVID, right? So the government's 2021 budget had $172 million to enhance the government's ability to collect data specifically on diverse populations, but without specifically allotting some of that money to study the pandemic impact on Black Canadians, it's unlikely that any of it will be, right? So, but then there's another big one, and that was there was $85 million in there for what they called a new anti-racism strategy and a national action plan on combating hate, right? And this strategy would essentially combine the government's efforts to combat systemic discrimination, including systemic anti-Black racism, with the government's efforts to combat, which is what they call hate, right? Now, the problem is that systemic discrimination and what they mean by hate, which isn't really well defined, are fundamentally different, right? Systemic discrimination like that faced by Black and Indigenous folks in Canada refers to discrimination by state bodies like the police, schools, and the healthcare system, and private institutions like banks and employers, resulting in disproportionate numbers of Black and Indigenous people being jailed, disproportionate numbers of Black and Indigenous people, being suspended, disproportionate number of Black and Indigenous students being suspended, expelled, and streamed into non-academic courses, and worse health outcomes for Black and Indigenous folks. So, although a recently released StatsCan hate crimes report showed that Black Canadians, in fact, faced the most hate crimes of any group in 2020, systemic anti-Black racism is the far worse and fundamental problem. And this isn't to say that hate crimes and hate groups aren't big problems and shouldn't be addressed. They are, and they should, but they aren't examples of systemic discrimination or systemic anti-Black racism. So the government should keep those separate, because history shows that when things like that are combined, addressing anti-Black racism tends to fall to the bottom, right? So instead, the government should create, I've heard Black folks call for this, a special envoy on combating systemic anti-Black racism, like the ones that this budget funds for combating anti-Semitism and Islamophobia.
Okay, thanks very much, Robin. Those are excellent observations, and thank you for contributing that. I'm going to go back to Leah now, and Jim and Avi both talked about the supply and confidence agreement between the NDP and the Liberal government. And I think one question that a lot of people have is, how did the budget stack up in meeting the terms of that agreement? Now, certainly dental care, that a couple of you mentioned, has been a very good start. It's an historic win for our public healthcare system. But I guess the question is, Leah, are you satisfied that the agreement overall has been upheld in this budget?
Well, look, I want to start out. Dental care is a victory, and we know that there's some new funding in co-op housing. We haven't seen that for many years. This is the first time we've seen it in many years. But this budget, from my perspective, falls short of addressing different crises we face right now. Dental care, absolutely. Like in my constituency, Winnipeg Centre has the highest child poverty rate, for example, Libby, of any urban riding in the country at 40%. So free dental care for children, which is due to roll out by the end of the year, is certainly going to help many children and families with their dental health and certainly prevention to avoid other illnesses that can result if dental health is left untreated. And this is a direct result of, NDP MPs. I want to give a shout out to Davies, who really championed this in the House of Commons in terms of dental care. But in terms of healthcare, there's all sorts of areas in this budget that fall short. I talked about the care economy, in the last question. And the total neglect of it. Like we saw a crisis in long-term care, crises with healthcare workers being overworked throughout a pandemic. Like I can't even believe, like it's shocking to me they were left out of the budget. But also as somebody who's fought for a very long time to end the genocide against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit, guess how much was put in the budget as an increase? $0 in this past budget by the Liberals to respond and implement the calls for justice of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. I mean, this government doesn't even pretend to care. We didn't even see $5, yet we saw an increase of $8 billion in military spending. Another example is in Indigenous housing. The AFN actually asked for what they needed to deal with housing, an estimated $44 billion over 10 years. AFN said, we need this. This is required to address the housing crisis on reserve. Guess how much budget 2022 gave? $2.4 billion over 5 years. This is unacceptable. So you want to talk about spin. They talk about, historic investments, and maybe that is. But if you compare 44 billion, which is needed, to the 2 billion that the government actually allocated, maybe we need to reassess what historic investments are in terms of upholding human rights in this country. And I would put into, what Avi mentioned in terms of, a clean, healthy, and safe environment as a human right, something that this government is demonstrating. They are clearly not committed to this human right because they continue to bail out big oil at the expense of human rights of people. And certainly I would say on the front lines of that, Indigenous people throughout the country. So I think certainly dental care is great. But, I was elected by the good people of Winnipeg Centre. This budget falls short of meeting the serious human rights crises that I have to deal with in my community, that people in my community are dealing with on a daily, particularly related to basic human rights that we don't see in this budget, food security programs, housing, a guaranteed livable basic income, the failure of this government to implement pharmacare, for example, and the disability benefit nowhere to be found. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so,
thank you, Libby.
I mean, to get back to the supply and confidence agreement, which the NDP is committed to supporting the government in confidence measures, and basically the first test is this budget. It seems to me, based on what you're saying, then it puts an awful lot of pressure in terms of that agreement for follow-up years. Like I heard Jagmeet Singh talk about the pharmacare doesn't have to come until 2023, but I mean, it really puts a lot of pressure on that agreement and what it is the NDP can hope to do in terms of holding the Liberal government accountable, not only on the agreement, but on their overall commitments.
Well, I think, this dental care is certainly a start, but there's nothing in that confidence and supply agreement that says we don't have to keep pushing. There's nothing in that confidence and supply agreement that says this is a perfect ideal budget. And the Liberals have, won over the Canadian left. It's clear that the Liberals have a long way to go. It's clear that they need folks like myself and my colleagues that are currently sitting in the House of Commons to keep pushing. I'm not going to stop pushing until the needs of my community are met, until the needs of all the people that are living in Canada and are met, and until we really truly uphold our responsibility to ensure a safe, clean, and healthy environment as a human right.
Thanks, Leah. Talking about the supply and confidence agreement, many people will no doubt ask the government or how the government plans to pay for things like dental care and pharmacare that are a direct result of the agreement, but they won't ask the same about the government's decision to buy the F-35 planes and increase the military budget to 1.5% of GDP. This is a question for everyone can chime in. What is the government's decision to increase military spending now say about the current moment that we're in? And why don't we want to start with Abby?
Yeah, I mean, if budgets are about choices and they're indications of political priorities, the Liberals were really clear in this budget. They finally, after campaigning against them, after not doing it for years, they approved. They said they're going to approve this fighter jet process. They picked one of the biggest American defense contractors on planet Earth. It is a massive piece of corporate welfare. $19 billion overshadows everything else in the budget, overshadows dental care, overshadows climate spending, overshadows everything. And, I don't know. I mean, I'm a little old fashioned when it comes to defense spending. I understand nation states, settler colonial projects of nation states have defense needs. But as far as I know, weapons have one purpose, which is to kill people. And the way that the defense economy works, with the United States next door as the biggest military spender and of more than all other countries on Earth combined, when we assign $19 billion of our public money as a direct transfer to an American multinational defense company, that's a massive piece of corporate welfare that's going to generate, let's count the jobs in the defense sector in Canada and count how many hundreds of millions of dollars per hour or of the labor force is we're paying for with that money. It's incredibly inefficient as a job creator. It just harnesses us to the American imperial project for the next generation. And it's incomprehensible from the point of view of working class folks in this country. It's not for us. And it is a massive priority for the government. It was a gigantic shock doctrine moment and a disaster capitalism moment where this, Putin's invasion of Ukraine is despicable. It's indefensible. It's horrific, the amount of violence that's being done to innocent civilians. And the response is not to hand over tens of billions of dollars to American defense contractors. It just can't be. But it was an opportunity for this powerful lobby to finally win what it had been fighting for so many years. And it's a major capitulation on the part of the Liberals, in my view.
Mm-hmm. The shock doctrine. I've heard that. Who wrote that?
It was written in this room right here, so I had to invoke it.
And it was discussed on Counterspin once. I remember it.
Indeed. Oh my God, we're in a time machine, people.
I have to go on Counterspin.
Leah or Jim, did you want to chime in on the F-35s?
Well, I just want to say, what does it say about the time we're in? I think it's the time we've always been in. The Liberals have historically and continue to always give the wealthiest, most profitable corporations a break. The F-35s, I mean, they campaigned against it. Now they're funding it. No jobs, as Avi said here. And for what purpose? I mean, we know what F-35s are for, and they're not, they're directly to harm civilians. I mean, that's what happens with F-35s. They could have made other choices. They always make the same choice. Like they could pay for all the things that I'm complaining about tonight in terms of no spending on, like housing, $0 to address the ongoing genocide of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And for example, they could expand and penalize big grocery chains, big oil companies, and other corporations that, for example, earn windfall profits during the pandemic. I mean, Jeff Bezos is flying to the moon right now, and I can't get houses in my community. I think he needs to pay his fair share. Canada's grocery stores, you go to the grocery store, they made $3.9 billion more profit in 2021. And people in my constituency can't afford food anymore. It's out of reach, and all these billionaires are laughing to the bank. And Canada's billionaires, in fact, saw their wealth grow by 111 billion over the last 2 years. So there's clear choices here. When I hear Minister Freeland talk about, okay, we have to start tightening up the purse strings, I'm thinking, for who? For people needing the disability benefit that didn't see it again in the budget, or the people in need of affordable, accessible housing with rent geared to income? Is that the purse strings? Because it's certainly not the billionaires. It's certainly not the big grocery chains who saw net profits. And it's certainly not the billions of dollars that this government is going to spend when people are literally rolling on the streets, becoming unsheltered for the first time in droves more than ever. They're going to spend that money on F-35 jets. I think priorities need to shift, but I think these priorities have always been there with the Liberal and Conservatives, definitely.
All right, thank you, Leah. That is, you mentioned corporate profits. I want to go to Jim now. Jim, the budget did include some measures to tax excess corporate profits, enough, in fact, to have the Financial Post exclaim, quote, "Tax hit is just one of the ways Ottawa is making large financial institutions pay for the COVID recovery," unquote. So while the one-time excess profit tax of an additional 15% on financial institutions is an important move, according to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, it falls short of addressing other sectors like oil and gas, big tech, and big box retail, who declared a combined net income of $107 billion last year. What could the government do to go further?
Right. Well, again, this is another interesting area, and I don't know how much, again, Jagmeet's chats with Justin had to do with this, but that was a pretty significant move. I mean, basically, the government has retroactively said, you banks made a hell of a lot of money last year, and we're going to take some with a special 15% tax. This is the kind of thing that the National Post calls confiscation. And 15% of that profit is quite a bit of money. That was $4 billion from that one-time grab. Now, so that's again interesting. It's not what you would expect. And if you include those two measures and some of the other revenue measures, I think this was actually the biggest new taxing budget that we have seen in a long time. Not enough, again, I stress, not enough. We should increase the taxes more on the banks, and we should increase them on other sectors as well, including the corporate side. But from our perspectives as progressives who've been making this argument for decades, let's be honest about, I think we've made a difference here. To see them do a big one-time grab on bank profits and then increase the overall corporate tax rate for them to 16.5% from 15%. Now, remember, of course, it used to be 28%. Then the Liberals cut it to 21%. Then Harper cut it to 15%. Now it's going back to 16.5%. And it's not the first time the corporate tax has come back up in Canada. A couple of the provinces have done it as well, including Ontario under the Liberals there. So I think this is encouraging and it's significant. Now, 1.5% on the banks is not enough. That'll be probably about an extra $500 million a year going forward. I would like to see it go back to 25% for the banks. These banks, honestly, they have a license to print money. That is not an exaggeration. They actually have a license to print money. So no wonder they make such profit. And I'm under no qualms about grabbing another 15% of that profit last year, because their profit was entirely due to the government fiscal stimulus and the support from the central bank, from the Bank of Canada, including the quantitative easing, where they were just buying up all the bonds, including on the secondary market, which means the Bank of Canada was buying them from banks. So, the banks literally have got nothing to complain about. So this is a step in the right direction, but again, it needs to go further. So I would like to see a differential profit rate on banks. I think that makes sense. We argued that all along when they were cutting the tax rate in the first place. I would like to see a special profits tax on the petroleum sector for sure. They are making money hand over fist because of this price surge arising from Ukraine. This is another important one where we have to, educate people about where the hell did that $2 a liter gasoline price come from? That the oil that made that gas was pumped in Canada 6 months before the Russians invaded Ukraine. And there's no impact on supply. In fact, as Avi pointed out at the beginning, supply is growing, not shrinking. And this is a problem. This is a bad thing. But you can't say that this is all due because of the war of Ukraine. This is due to a speculative, privatized, globalized energy commodity system where when any shock occurs, any uncertainty, the price shoots up and consumers pay and oil companies profit. So the profits in the energy sector are going to be humongous this coming year. Why not a 15% tax on them? Just like we did on the banks, a one-time 15% excess profit tax, absolutely justified, and put the money into the just transition plan. That's another area where the government is still talking about just transition, but not putting in. Our research at the Center for Future Work says $1 billion a year would ensure a 20-year phase out of all oil and gas jobs in Canada without a single layoff. $1 billion a year is peanuts in the grand scheme of these things, and the government's got ample resources to do that with. So again, a step in the right direction, but they have to go a lot further.
Can I just add one quick footnote to this, Libby?
Go ahead, Ravi.
It just highlights for me the point that it's not actually about the math. It's not about do we have the money, is the money there, or even where the money goes. It's about power. It's about whose interests are being served in society. That's the fundamental equation. Because the act of the low-hanging fruit, I mean, we're surrounded. It's like a gigantic fruit cocktail of low-hanging fruit here, of the things that we could do now that the pandemic has changed the landscape for government spending. Because we are in a new period of history where people are seeing the Canadian government spend large amounts of money directly to assist people in emergencies. Well, the pandemic's not the only emergency that we're in. The housing emergency is something we haven't hit yet, but it's the same thing. While corporations are buying up buildings and rent-evicting renters and increasing their share price, right? Whether real estate trusts or real estate corporations, it's the same thing. We have huge financial players that are making out like bandits, and the money's there to be had, but the political will and the actual shift of the balance of power in society is what is required before we start redistributing it in a way that wouldn't just make the National Post upset, make them apoplectic, and that's what we need.
That's what we need. Well, I can tell you, you're all unpacking a lot of really great stuff because the questions are just flying in from people who are watching. So we want to get Libby, to the questions. Yeah.
Just before you get, I just want to jump in and just confirm what Jim said, make sure everyone didn't miss this, because I only learned this myself. The banks, as he said, they literally do have a license to print money. There's two entities in Canada that can print money, the Bank of Canada and the banks. I didn't even know that. It's written on the Bank of Canada's own website.
So, okay.
All right. Robin, the only nuance to that is we use the term print money in a colloquial sense. They're not actually printing it because it's not money in our wallet anymore. It's entries in an account computer. So they create money. They have a license to create money, and they create tens of billions of it every month. And so no wonder they got money that we can collect 15% of, an extra 15% of.
Okay, I know we wanted to talk about inflation issues and the cost of living, but I do want to get to the questions, which Robin's going to handle. But we wanted to quickly flag the budget's commitments in regards to Indigenous rights and reconciliation, because this is a key matter that we've been following all along. So I guess the question is, were there actually any wins in the budget for Indigenous peoples? I mean, I heard what you said earlier, Leah, about the missing and murdered Indigenous women. There was nothing in the budget. In terms of any other issues affecting Indigenous peoples, anybody got a quick comment on how the budget impacted that?
So I just want to make a note. I mean, like, I have to say, I mean, this is just life as an Indigenous person in Canada. It's called really underwhelming. But there was also things that were quite violent in the budget, including the 51 million that was given to RCMP to assist in the investigation of the undiscovered graves, burial grounds of children around residential school, RCMP officers that were part of the system to kidnap kids. That was their role, from communities, and kidnap them and ship them off to residential school. Why the government thought it was appropriate to give $51 million to the RCMP to be involved in a system that they are implicated in, it was shocking to me. And so, certainly we saw recently with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, an agreement in principle yet to be an agreement. Let's keep our fingers crossed. That was a positive step forward. But I think, I've said it before, unless people in politics are ready to commit to reconciliation, not only when it suits their political and economic interests, then they need to stop using the word. And I think this country has a long way to go before it truly is practicing reconciliation. And not just using the word. So that's my position on the budget. I'm just being honest.
Yep, yeah. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Leah, and thank you, everybody. All right, let's get to some audience questions. And holy smokes, we have a bunch of them here. All right, we got one for, I guess it'd be for Leah. Leah, this is from Barry Morris asking, if the NDP is really committed to a guaranteed livable income, and it has to be tied to transition to the green economy, then what is the realistic chance of it being implemented now with the NDP Liberal Alliance?
Well, look, the whole entire NDP caucus endorsed my motion for a guaranteed livable basic income. It's certainly something that's widely supported by membership, a guaranteed livable basic income. But I don't think it really is about parties. I mean, I think it's about movements. I think it's about people. If people in power feel that their power and privilege will be threatened by not supporting something, then it usually shifts the direction that they're taking. I think, certainly seeing the full adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Romeo Saganash's bill, Bill C-262, which turned into Bill C-15 with the Liberal government, was a directly in response to a lobbying effort across the country, went from it's not going to happen to becoming one of the key bills in the last parliament. So I have not lost hope. I have my bill in place, Bill C-223. It's gone through first reading. I think it'll go through second reading in fall. But, sometimes it takes time, but this is what Canadians want. If you look at polls, this is what people are asking for across Canada. Certainly, women's organizations that are working in the area of gender-based violence see a guaranteed livable basic income as a necessity if we want to begin tackling the epidemic of violence against women, girls, and diverse gendered peoples, that is one of the key way forwards, in addition to current and future government programs and support. So I say keep pushing, and eventually people listen.
Thanks, Leah. This one's for everybody. From Laurie Goldman is asking, what can the public do while the government and industry are dedicated to ignoring the dire warnings of climate catastrophe? Do we need a huge general strike? Anyone can jump in there. Yep.
General strikes are great when you've built the power to pull one off. And I definitely think it's a tactic that would speak to a different balance of forces in society. But yeah, when we get to the point where we can call a general strike, we'll be threatening power, as Leah said. And you can't pull that one out if you can't pull it off. and I don't think we're anywhere near. We actually need to build a societal coalition. And there's something else that has to come into play, and that is we are in another new landscape beyond the pandemic, and that is one in which the convoy politics has rewired the conservative movement industry, and that's been discussed on this show a lot. But it's significant, and the political phenomenon in Canada right now is Pierre Poilievre, and he's getting an undue amount of attention, but that's because he's getting big crowds at the very beginning of a leadership race, and he is speaking to the incredibly difficult time that working class people are having getting by, and he's saying working class people, and that's significant, and we are not on the left are not answering that incredible naming of just what the reality is for people. And this speaks to the inflation conversation. It speaks to the price gouging of the West and the grocery cartel. It speaks to the price gouging at the pump, and and it speaks to the housing emergency. And the truth is that we are in a very dangerous moment where we are not actually naming how hard it is for people to get by. And we're not actually redirecting the narrative towards why and what would actually solve it. And so we have a liberal budget like this one that represents a tentative re-entering of the federal government into the housing sphere, which is good, but not in any way commensurate with what's actually required. Because we need somebody standing in front of the $4.8 million house in Vancouver, like Pierre Poilievre does, and saying, this house is $4.8 million because we have turned housing into a Amsterdam tulip bubble, into a speculative frenzy, into a making money hand over fist for people who already have too much. Those are the villains in the current affordability crisis. And the answer is not to be found in the market, which is being gamed by the most powerful players. The answer is to be found in non-market housing, in public housing. We need to inject F-35 level money into building housing outside the market and not profit, so that people have places to live. And the co-op investment, which was a handful of millions, there should be billions of dollars in co-op housing. So we need to be asserting in this moment in my view, a very blunt left populist messages that names the villains, that names people's pain in terms of the unaffordability of life in Canada, and actually proposes solutions that would change it and that take aim at the powers that are making just disgusting profits from the inability of people to get by and pay rent.
Thanks, Avi.
But I don't have any strong feelings about this.
Actually, Leah, do you have any comments on that? Like, the next question is going to Jim, but do you have any comments on what people can do while the government and industry are dedicated to ignoring the dire warnings of climate catastrophe?
Well, I think, going back, movements are powerful. I think, we have to continue to push the government. Clearly they're showing where their alliances are. That's with the oil and gas industry. I mean, certainly I agree. The oil and gas industry seems to be, the cash cow of the federal budget. They certainly reap the benefits of it, and I think that's why it's important to elect strong progressive representatives in the House of Commons to fight for people. We currently have a government that's not doing that. And I think we see that in the fact that nothing's being done to mitigate the climate emergency in real time.
Thanks, Leah. Jim, one for you. Can you comment on the best way to tax land speculation? The questioner says, this is one of the biggest reasons for higher costs in Canada, including cost of doing business. Small worker-owned factories cannot set up since land is so expensive to purchase.
Well, the questioner is absolutely right, Robin. Speculation in land is what's driving that tulip bubble in the housing market that Avi was just talking about. Yeah, and that anyone who's ever tried to insure a house that they own, and then you go to the insurance company and they talk about the replacement value of the house. I don't know, of course, how many of us have a house. I don't have one anymore. But when I did, I was always gobsmacked because replacement value of the actual building was small compared to the package of the overall property. And it is the land underneath that becomes the asset for speculation. And the prices have skyrocketed precisely because of the bank's power to create money out of thin air and lend it to people so that they can bid up the price of housing. If you actually had to pay real money for these things, there's no way that house that Pierre Poilievre stood in front of would ever get to $4.8 million. It's all being, the bubble is being inflated with all that hot air money being pumped into it. So we have to stop that. Now, part of that is to tax speculation. I agree with that. Capital gains are treated as a special form of income, and you only pay tax on half of it. And that is, first of all, like throwing fuel on the fire of this bubble. But it's extremely unfair because the vast majority of capital gains are earned by the richest 10% of Canadians. So 100% we should eliminate that capital gains exemption and other investment-friendly tax loopholes like the dividend tax credit. Secondly, we have to build non-market housing. The way to short-circuit that whole speculative process is to take the land out of speculation, which means owning it collectively, either in the form of social housing, co-ops, community land trusts, or any of the other myriad of ways that are out there to build housing that is built so that it's a roof over someone's head rather than a speculative asset. And I think there's a whole surge of interest in non-market housing now, and this is excellent. And again, Avi is right. The money that was put to that in this budget was just the beginning, and we need a lot more. But that's the ultimate way. Is you can see that in places. You go to cities in Europe or in Japan and Korea, where the majority of houses aren't privately owned. They're owned either in many cases as social housing or collective housing. Hong Kong, for example. So this is the real way to stop that speculative process that's put housing out of reach for so many people.
Great, thanks, Jim. Well, time flies. We've got right at the end, but one last question from the audience, and quick answers on this one. But it is a question for Deanna Van Eek, who asks, she didn't see anything on the Just Transition Act in the budget. Has there been any movement? Maybe that's over to Avi?
I've been following this because I've been, I was excited when Charlie Angus was appointed the Just Transition critic, and he's been doing good work on the National Natural Resources Committee, you know, pointing finger at big oil and the corporate welfare that's been flowing like diluted bitumen through a pipe directly to those folks in Calgary. And the supply and confidence agreement does include a Just Transition Act. It was promised by the Libs 3 years ago. We haven't seen it yet. There's a possibility that it'll come in fall. I think the supply and confidence agreement, it was clear that the biggest ticket item was dental care for low-income folks. And it was clear that that was going to be the first big one, and that was going to come in the first budget. The Just Transition Act, interestingly, is the only piece of the climate section of the supply and confidence agreement which is a little bit less vague. It actually says that a Just Transition Act has to be based on a consultation with Indigenous communities, First Nations, workers. Trade unions are named. It was a pleasure to that. Those words in the agreement. But the key, and I think we're going to, and the reason I've been following this so closely is I think we're going to have a big debate about just transition in Canada in the next year. And I think we've really got to blow open the definition of what it is. Because if you would define it the way the Notley government did in 2015, or the way the first Just Transition sort of commission that the Liberal government struck, that Hassan Youssef was on before his Senate appointment, was about a kind of a fine-tooled labor market adjustment for a small sector of workers. Just transition has to be defined as a justice-based societal transformation that addresses all of our intersecting emergencies with big holistic solutions. And so we've got a big narrative to win here in the next 6 months to a year, where we are going to have chances to have our input. And there's even a federal consultation going on right now to say a just transition is a transition of society. It's not just taking care of a handful of workers in one sector, who, by the way, are not going to be displaced if we keep increasing oil and gas production. So we're not going to have a just transition unless there's an actual transition going on. And that means slashing emissions, and that means doing something about fossil fuel production in Canada. And we got to win that one in the next 6 months too. Luckily,
Hey,
we're ready to fight.
Avi and Libby, I got to jump in. I just saw that comment from Judy Rebick. She's in the audience. How wonderful. So it can't be counterspin. It's got to be face off. Or it's got to be counterspin
Yes.
face off. Or maybe counter face or face spin or something like that.
Spin off. Spin off if you mind.
We'll do our best to keep it going. Well, listen, folks, the time has just flown by. And I have to say to each of you panelists, you guys have been just awesome in packing in so much information in such a short time period. And it's generated a huge amount of audience reaction, questions, comments, feedback. So I wish we had more time. But unfortunately, the time has gone by. So I do want to thank each of you, Leah Gazan, Jim Stanford, and Avi Lewis, and my co-host, Browne. It's been a great panel discussion today. Just to let everyone know that our next panel will take place Tuesday, May the 17th. So please stay tuned for updates on that event, and be sure to sign up to Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca/alerts to make sure you get the invitation. And finally, I always say this, Robin does too, thank you to Rabble for actually creating a space to host these very important discussions. And, you know, Rabble is celebrating its 21st anniversary this weekend. And Judy Rebick was the founder of Rabble, one of the founders, and it's so great that Judy is online today. 21 years, which is not easy for independent progressive media. So both Robin and I encourage you to help Rabble out by becoming a monthly donor at rabble.ca/donate. So thank you all again, panelists, audience, for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you in May 17th. Don't forget to mark it on your calendars. Have a good evening, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Great
you.
to see you all.